Hi, good afternoon. I'm Radhika Iyer, and as Manish said, we're very, very happy and honored to have Aatish Taseer, writer, journalist, someone who's currently living between New York and New Delhi. He's the son of Tavleen Singh, Indian journalist, and Mr. Salman Taseer, late Salman Taseer, who was a Pakistani politician. And with that, I think the journey for his life was set. Having an Indian mother and a Pakistani father. You, of course, grew up in India. And before we get to Twice Born, which is such a fascinating idea itself, tell us about the part of India that you relate to. You speak a lot about different facets of India, about possibly how there are two Indias in one India?
Radhika, just to separate this, the India I grew up in was incredibly isolated, incredibly protected, and it was like that for my mother as well. A cocoon of language, of convent school education, of public school education, of privilege, of a system. I mean, the generation of my grandparents had been able to be culturally bilingual. By the time we come to my parents' generation and my generation, all of that has fallen away. And so there is no real Indian reality for me growing up in Delhi. And I think as I see younger people today, I think it's even more acute. So the journey for me, which is kind of the premise of the Twice Born, if Stranger to History, my first book, was a lateral journey where I was traveling through the Islamic world, traveling through Pakistan, traveling to discover in a kind of lateral way. The basis of the Twice Born is that feeling of the distance that can exist between two people who are no further apart than us, the distance of centuries, and I'm traveling almost in a vertical, internal way, excavating that very strange Indian situation of being right next to each other and of being in completely almost several hundred years apart, and so this is one of the kind of the funny thing about this book is most books of travel or memoir, they're books of movement, and this is a book of being very still, of stasis, and of trying to understand what was responsible historically and culturally for the way that I grew up, for that incuriosity, for that cultural isolation, for the feeling of, I don't like to use this word, but we can use it, deracination. And remember that none of this is benign, because by the time that the book evolves, by the time the Modi election comes up, there's another side that has not just been ignoring this situation, but is engaging with it very provocatively, very powerfully, and is creating what is almost like a kind of cultural revolution at the ballot box. So it's a very combustible situation. Is what, I guess what I'm trying to lay out for you just to start out.
Right. That's where I'd like to ask you. There is a real side, you said, and then there is another side. Let's just call it another side.
So very funny. Aldous Huxley, traveling in Japan, he has this idea of he says, everywhere I go, lovers of this country will tell me, the real Japan. And he says, what matters is not the real Japan. He says, what matters is this new industrial country that's like projecting itself into the future. And when we get into this moment where we're craving authenticity, yes, where the head of the RSS is saying, rapes happen not in Bharat, but in India, where the West meets in Bharat, yes, and India is created. That's where, so these words that we use for real, and they're not, by the way, they're not particular to us. Sarah Palin is talking about the real America. Exactly. So these are four lines.
And here, very close home in Britain. In Britain, they're talking about the outsider element, which is destroying Britain and the real Britain.
Right. So one of the questions at the heart of the book is this business of negotiating authenticity, of dealing with that thing that drove the Russians into a panic in the 19th century of what is ours and what came from outside, of balancing a feeling of not wanting to lose one's allegiances, and at the same time not wanting to shut oneself off from the appeal as well as the intellectual challenge of this relationship, we can call it with the West, or with which is it's a kind of conversation that's been almost 150 years in the making. And if you read a novel like Tagore's Gora, you feel that India for 150 years has been wringing its wrists over this question of what is ours, what has come from outside, and a civilization very proud of its ability to synthesize. You know, one person in the Twice Born says to me, he says, everyone came through India. And he says everyone became Indian. He says the Muslims presented a very great challenge of arms. The destruction was, but he said we were able to absorb their thought. It was not an intellectual challenge. He says with the coming of Europe, for the first time we had a challenge of arms, but we also had a challenge. He said their thought content was very provocative, very powerful. And so it was, to use a phrase that Arthur Kessler uses, he says, you know, we ruled by rape, but we influenced by seduction. And there's a chapter where there's this business of dealing with the rape and seduction. This conversation is 150 years in the making, and it's no nearer to being resolved in India.
Let's come to Twice Born, which you said is a parallel take on his earlier book, Stranger to History. You sort of deal with casteism in a way that sounds very, very real, and as if it's there, as if you can see it and touch it physically.
It is, yeah.
I'm trying to get the context to the point where we're 2 months away from general elections in India. And it's 2019, we've been saying it time and a dozen times about how caste, culture or religion should not be associated with politics, but that just never happens, because just about each election, it really becomes the force that drives the election. What is your sense of what is happening in India today?
My sense of what's happening in it, firstly, just quickly on caste, like this is the deepest level of identity we have, to the extent that, you know, once when I was traveling in Pakistan, in Sindh, I met a man who spent his whole time bad-mouthing India. And at the end of it, he quietly whispers to me, he says, but I'm a Rajput Muslim. And I said, you know, तुम्हें शर्म नहीं आती, तुम इंडिया की तंकीद कर दो, जात की बात कर रहे हो? He said, ये जात की बात नहीं है, ये good or bad families की बात. This is a country for 60 years has had no contact with the Hindu caste system, and still deep in their heart is this idea. But coming to what we're talking about in India, I feel it's a moment of tremendous disappointment. What happened in 2014, and I was very enthusiastic, I covered that election. It was a political phenomenon, but it was also a cultural phenomenon. There was, and believe me, like as many people from your channel often would ask people in the East Purvanchal, ji mandir ke baare mein, but tell us about the temple. And they'd say, aap kyun mandir ki baat kar rahe hain? Hum vikas ki baat kar rahe hain, aap mandir ke baare mein pooch rahe hain. Why are you asking us? And so there was this real moment where there was a cultural element in the sense that people felt that after this age of custodianship, where an anglicized elite had kind of had in some ways managed the energy and potential of India, for the first time, India was trusting to itself. It was taking a gamble on a man who was speaking a language that was very, very enticing, and it was true that his origins were in chauvinism, were in a certain, but he seemed to be moving away. And what we've had in these 5 years has been a bitter economic disappointment. The total not materialization of jobs, of economic opportunities, and a poisoning, a vitiating of the atmosphere. The air has been spoilt in India. You know, so 2019 rolls around, and we're talking about cows and temples, and whether like Rahul Gandhi is a Brahmin or not. You know, so it's a moment of kind of, it's about as bleak a moment as I've seen in India since like the dark days of, like, you know, the Punjab insurgency, and you know, it's a moment where there's nothing 2019 offers that anyone can get excited about right now.
I'll come to 2019 in a bit. You said somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said India is ignoring its beauty in a rush to develop.
Okay, this is a mangled statement for sure.
My question here is, India is in a rush to. India is ignoring its beauty in a rush to develop, which means, do you acknowledge there has been some development or an earnest effort?
I think what I'm talking about is something that goes to the heart of my book as well, is that we had, and it's right there at the freedom movement moment, people like Kumaraswamy, people like Alice Bono, who features in this book, are constantly pressing, Chattopadhyay, constantly pressing people like Nehru and Sarojini Naidu for this idea of cultural freedom. They're saying, like, this is a country that's gone through 700-800 years of a kind of foreign rule, and now when independence comes, well, political freedom can't simply be the... And people like Bose and Nehru and Naidu are pushing back and saying, once we get political freedom, don't you worry, cultural freedom will come by itself. And it turns out that actually the real profound work of colonization happens after independence. That is when generation after generation is like, kind of achieves the ends of Macaulay to a point where, like, Macaulay himself would be surprised. And so what I must have had in mind with this is not a business of ignoring beauty in order to develop, but the idea that if that moment when, which is a cultural moment, where a civilization has a profound synthesis with another civilization, where a meeting occurs that's fertile, that if that doesn't happen, if India is purely in the game of imitating results and not assimilating methods, if India is not in a deeper conversation with the West, then what it achieves by way of development will be superficial, will be imitative, will be false, and it'll fall down. And you'll see that that it's impossible to describe what this moment is till it occurs, till you see that moment when the Far East, for instance, places like Japan, after a lot of sort of hand-wringing themselves, suddenly something happens, and this very confident culture meets the other culture and is able to take the story forward in a way that is plain to everyone to see, that both, you know, like that a third thing has developed out of this meeting. India, except for that 19th century moment in Bengal, which had promise, that feeling has not occurred. People, there is, and it was definitely some of the things that was feeding into the Modi election, is that people feel a sense of cultural loss. They feel acted upon. Sometimes they feel like they've been changed without even leaving the place that they grew up in.
Does it then mean that 2019 is going to be a case of an extremely frustrated voter? Because if the urban Indian is feeling like this government hasn't delivered what it promised, and if the alternative isn't quite an alternative or is not even ready to be an alternative, how precarious is the situation?
Well, it's not, I don't know if it's precarious. It's, you know, I live in America, and part of the year I don't like Donald Trump. But if you said to me now, after all that's occurred, oh well, here's Hillary again, I would say no, that's very depressing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
And the Congress Party, like, we've been through all of this, through a full cataclysm, and they're saying, oh well, now you have Rahul Gandhi and you have his sister, so go ahead and go to, you know. I mean, what are you to do with that? And you have side by side the failure of Modi. He can dress it up any way he wants, but it's been a failure. And so it's I don't know what to say to you except that there's no outlet.
I think you will be accused of not having a fair assessment, and so will I.